America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we're joined by James Burling. James is the author of Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. He's also the vice president of legal affairs at the Pacific Legal Foundation. He's joining us today to discuss why both Republicans and Democrats are failing at solving America's housing crisis. James, welcome to Main Street Matters. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, tell us about your book. We saw your piece in the New York Post, why Republicans and Democrats are failing, and you have this new book out that really looks at the hidden story of America's housing crisis. Tell us about the book.
So I've been litigating property right issues for Pacific Legal Foundation for 40 years, and this is representing smaller individuals who could not otherwise afford representation. We do it pro bono. And the common thread that I've seen in so many of these cases is we have one failed government policy after another that prevents people from using their property for reasonable purposes, such as building homes where people need to live. And so I've looked at the history of how we got to where we are. I've looked at the history of the excessive, sometimes outrageous zoning systems that we have in place in cities and counties across America. I've looked at rent control. I've looked at the environmental regulations that just take huge swaths of land off limits for building new housing. I've looked at the procedural problems of the lawsuits that are brought, one lawsuit filed after another lawsuit after another lawsuit. And I talk about how we got to this place in my book, Nowhere to Live. And then I talk about some potential solutions of not more government programs, but removing some of the government barriers that have been put up to building the housing that people need to live in order to end our housing crisis.
What are some of the biggest government barriers to building more housing, more affordable housing?
Well, we have in a lot of communities, it's just impossible to build the new starter homes or townhomes or triplexes, things that would be affordable to the new couple starting out or to somebody who is a working salary, but not a tech bro in Silicon Valley. And so these are the people that I'm focusing on. And we have so many communities across America that have large lot, single family zoning, sometimes 5, 10, 160 acre minimum lot sizes for building homes. Well, you can't find an affordable place if you have those kind of minimum lot sizes. So that's one key aspect. We need to reform the zoning system we have to allow more of what is often called the missing middle. That is the duplexes and triplexes and small apartment buildings that simply are legal to build in most places of this country, that we need to address that head on and fix that in a way that keeps the integrity of our existing neighborhoods, but at the same time allows our children to live where we live in our own communities by building housing that they can afford.
James, I feel like I had a bit of a front row seat to this affordable housing crisis. I lived in a middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles for 6 years that was really trying to build out new housing units. But the NIMBYism was just absolutely out of control among the neighbors and the people who lived in the single family homes nearby. And I would say they were all single issue voters at the county level, just purely on not allowing any more densification or any more units. And that's all they voted on. They couldn't care anything less. So it's very difficult to fight that entrenched political power, especially when the other people who might be coming in would just be renters. In your book, do you discuss any solutions to or do you discuss this NIMBYism problem and any potential solutions to it?
Yeah, I certainly do discuss the NIMBYism problem. And I think one of the keys is to educate people that live in these middle class neighborhoods that having higher density is not going to affect their property values. There are studies out there that show when you allow higher density, property values, in fact, can go up because you're able to utilize the property for higher uses than single family homes. A triplex is more economically beneficial to the owner than a single family. There is that. There is second, you need a recognition that what we're dealing with is infringing on the property rights of owners of property to make reasonable use of their property. I'm not talking about putting an 80-story apartment building in a residential suburb, but I'm talking about allowing just some minimal but significant increase in the density that would be allowed that would make this work. Also, we look at court cases where the zoning goes too far at Pacific Legal Foundation. And finally, there is at the state level, the localities are able to do the zoning that they do because the state government has given them that authority. And the state governments around the country often should do more to encourage municipalities saying, look, we're giving you this zoning power. That's great. But at the same time, you have to accommodate people that are on starting out, people that need starter homes, people that need affordable places to live. We just can't simply have the states allow every community to zone those people out because you end up in a situation like yours. My son's about your age, and he has a good job. He lives in Orange County, California, and he can't afford a place to live. He's got roommates. And for somebody and starting out like that, he should. I was able to afford a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 900 square foot home when I started out in Tucson, Arizona, back in the 70s, and it cost me about $20,000. I mean, it's absurd that there's nothing close to that, even in today's dollars, anywhere.
Yeah. So the neighborhood I was in is called Palms, and it's beside Culver City on the west side. And what they were putting in were essentially 5-story apartment buildings, maybe part of this missing middle that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And there was a series of those going up, and that was just had all the neighbors in a conniption fit. My hope was, thinking big, why just 5 stories? Why can't, besides the engineering and financial challenges the developer might have, why can't we put up a 50-story apartment building, or maybe not that high, but I feel like there's so many of just these smaller places. It would just be so nice to have these big towers. Is it just a problem of the zoning laws, why we can't do that? Or what are some of the hurdles to some really pie in the sky thinking on this?
So it's certainly not technological. We can build skyscrapers like that. We can build large apartment buildings. It is purely a zoning issue. We have the infrastructure, and if you're building a large apartment building, you may have to chip in to increase the sewer system. You may have to worry about, you may have to deal with roads and fix intersections and things like that. That's all part of the process. But the fact is, it is just virtually impossible to build. You talk about 50-story, 5-story, or a 5-unit complex in most parts of the suburbs of California and most states. It is just illegal to do that. People love single-family homes, but you go into cities now like Austin, Texas, where you have single-family homes in the urban core, and outside of the jurisdiction of Austin, you have the big apartment buildings. And that's just completely backwards the way it normally would be. The inner cities should be the ones that have the bigger and taller apartment buildings, and you go out, it should be less and less dense. But our zoning laws have basically ripped that logic asunder and made it impossible for young people to find that new apartment or that new small starter home anywhere in large parts of the country. And as a result, we have a tremendous disparity between supply and demand. We need in California, for example, roughly 200,000 new housing units built a year. We've needed that for decades, and we're building in a good year about 100,000. So every year the disparity increases, and you can multiply that same effect across the country, and sometimes lesser degrees, sometimes perhaps a little more, but by and large, we're not keeping up with population. We're not keeping up with obsolescence, as older homes may have to be torn down. They get flooded, they get hit by a hurricane, that kind of thing. We're not building the homes to keep up with what we have. So what happens with the law of supply and demand? supply is diminished, demand remains high, prices go up and up and up, and it's going to continue that way until we learned how to build enough homes. And to do that, we need to primarily take care of zoning. There are also issues with environmental laws and, as I said, litigation. In my book, Nowhere to Live, I talk about a whole variety of government programs, such as environmental laws that take huge swaths of land off the table for development, such as lawsuits that keep projects tied up for years, sometimes decades, before they can be built.
You know, you talk about Democrats and Republicans failing on this issue, but Vice President Kamala Harris unveiled her economic policy plans, or some of them, at least on Friday. And one of them was actually building 2 million new units. And I don't really know what a unit means. Does that mean an apartment, a house, or whatever? But what do you think the broader impact of the government stepping in and building essentially government housing will be?
Well, first of all, I don't really see that happening. I see it a campaign promise. I'm hearkening back to Gavin Newsom, who 7 years ago promised to build 3 million new housing units, and that would be apartments and homes, starter homes, whatever, in California. And we haven't come close to a fraction of that. Government does a terrible job at building things, right? You look at public housing projects, and I talk about this in my book, Nowhere to Live, and I think government is really poor at designing projects. It's very bad at building them, and it's even worse at maintaining them. The only thing government is good at in housing projects is tearing them down when they turn out to be disasters. And I talk about that in my book, how the government has demolished a number of major housing projects because it just didn't know how to plan, build, and maintain them properly. So government is not where I see the answer coming from to building housing, because government's going to have the same constraints, whether it's a federal government or state government. We have the zoning laws that have to be dealt with. And there are private entrepreneurs that would love to put money into housing and home building, but they think it's kind of a waste. In my book, Nowhere to Live, I tell the story that developers in California have this joke amongst themselves that, why go through the process in California of trying to go through the permitting process and the endless lawsuits when it would be just easier to slit your throat. And that's, that's something that developers in California talk about. And it shouldn't be that hard. We have people that would love to make a small, reasonable profit from building homes, but there's nowhere to do that in large parts of the country. So we don't need government to get involved. And I'm very concerned if government starts pouring money and resources into something that it doesn't do very well, it's going to jack up the prices, not unlike what happened with higher education. When government started pouring lots of money into higher education, we got palaces where there used to be dormitories. We got tuition that just goes faster than inflation every year. And now students are caught holding the bag. And I'm afraid with government getting involved in housing, when we have a vibrant industry that could do it without government help, if government would get out of the way, I don't think that's the solution.
We see a lot of cities across the country. New York, for me, comes to mind, who implement rent control. And what is the impact, the realistic impact of rent control on cities when you limit what a landlord can raise rent by? So
there is an economist named Assar Lindbeck who 20, 30 years ago wrote this piece where he said that other than bombing in a war, rent control is the most effective way of destroying a city. And what he meant by that is when you have large areas of a city that are rent controlled and landlords can no longer make a reasonable profit, or actually they can only operate at a loss, they tend to abandon their buildings, and those buildings tend to be burned out hulks. And South Bronx in New York City was a classic example of that. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was burned out building after burned out building because it was just too expensive to maintain buildings under rent control. Now New York City reformed its rent control after that disaster, but in 2019 they've gone back to a more draconian rent control where landlords cannot recoup the investment for repairs and improving it. And what has happened is that the value of rental apartments to landlords is diminished. People aren't building rental units anymore that could be subject to rent control. I go to St. Paul, Minnesota in my book, Nowhere to Live, which just passed a few years ago, a rent control ordinance allowing only a 3% increase in rent per year, regardless of inflation. There were projects in St. Paul that were in process of being built. Sticks and bricks were coming out of the ground. Rent control was passed, and the workers and the equipment was pulled off the project because it didn't pencil out anymore with rent control. Rent control is the number one disincentive for building new apartment units and new rental units in any city that's adopted it. Where you have cities that are subject to rent control, people will not build new stuff if you think you're going to be currently or in the future subject to rent control. So what happens is supply diminishes and overall prices for housing goes up. People that are in rent controlled units may do better off, but those anywhere else do not. And one last thing about rent control, it's supposed to help the poor, working class people, et cetera, et cetera. But in every study that was done, and I talk about a study that we did in my book, Nowhere to Live, comparing rent controlled jurisdictions to non-rent controlled jurisdictions. And those people living in rent controlled jurisdictions tended to be whiter, richer, better educated, with fewer handicaps than people in non-rent controlled jurisdictions. Because the people that are richer and whiter and with steadier jobs, et cetera, tend to have more stability in their lives. They can stay in places longer, and they're more able to take advantage of rent control. So rent control really does not achieve its purpose of helping the poor and economically, socially dispossessed people. It really helps the status quo more than anything else. So I think rent control is an unmitigated disaster. And Vice President Kamala Harris's proposal to impose rent control on corporate ownership of apartments across America would be pretty much a unmitigated disaster at the nationwide level rather than the local level.
Yeah. James, one of the compromises that I'm seeing a lot in municipalities across the country is, okay, you're allowed to build, but a certain number, 25% of the units have to be reserved for affordable below rate housing. What do you think of this compromise, or are there hidden costs that we don't see with that?
Well, the cost isn't all that hidden because the 75% of the people that are building market rate housing have to subsidize the other 25%. So it's a very narrow type of tax just on the new home buyers. If a community thinks it is important to subsidize low-income housing, and there are all sorts of pros and cons of doing that, that should be borne by the taxpayers as a whole, not looking at new residents coming into a subdivision or an apartment building as being an ATM to service the city's desire for more low-income housing. Again, studies have shown that when you have these kind of mandates, so-called inclusionary zoning or affordable housing mandates, they don't work to really help the people that need them. And what they do is raise prices of housing overall. If we're talking about an affordability crisis, what we shouldn't be doing is making it more expensive to build homes.
Right. And then with the homelessness crisis, how responsible is the lack of affordable housing for the homelessness crisis, and how much of it is, in your view, just junkies and people with mental health issues that wouldn't even take a home even if it was affordable?
I think it's a combination of both. First of all, it used to be quite lawful to have boarding homes, to have single room occupancy hotels where you have the bedrooms and bathrooms down the hall. In most cities, these things are illegal. You can't have boarding homes because it's illegal to have too many unrelated people living in the same home, so on and so forth. So people on the economic margin are just starting out, don't have a place to live, and that creates a supply issue. So the cost of housing is a component of the homeless crisis that we see now. The other component, as you said, is the mental health and drug issues. And we have it in California, for example, we have a housing first idea that you provide housing first and don't require any kind of treatment. And in my book, Nowhere to Live, I talk about my experience as a volunteer in a mental hospital in the 1970s when I was an undergraduate. And I visited patients in a mental hospital in 1976. They all began to tell me, Jim, I'm going to a halfway house in Albany. Jim, I'm going to a halfway house in Schenectady. And I said, great. How long are you going to be there? Well, I'm going to be there 6 months. And what's going to happen after 6 months? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in 6 months. Nobody knew. And we all learned that what happened in 6 months is that people were let out onto the streets, and they became ill people in the streets and in the jails across America because the institutions were closed down. I'm not suggesting that we reopen the warehouses, these giant warehouses for the mentally ill that we used to have, but we need to do a much better job than we have done on community treatment. We need to provide an incentive saying that, look, we can give you a sheltered space, we can give you a place to live, but you have to see our counselors. You have to try to undergo drug treatment. You have to do something in exchange for what we're going to give you. Today, I saw an interview with a homeless person in San Francisco, and he said, for drug addicts like me, this is like Disneyland. I'm given a free place to put my tent. I'm given free needles. I get free food. What more could I want as a drug addict, right? And this is the wrong attitude. We need to have a little tougher love. But still, our heart should open up and try to help people. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is talking about, well, let's clear out the homeless camps. Well, good luck, because they still will have to be in a place and they still need treatment, and we're not doing that.
I have some personal experience as a landlord. Some years ago, my family purchased a fourplex, multiplex unit with 4 apartments, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. And one of the first things I learned, and this is in the state of Florida, as a landlord, is not to accept a program called Section 8 housing. And the reason being is that the government subsidizes the renter's rent by about 70 or 80%, and they're responsible for paying the other 20 to 30% of the rent. The problem is if you accept the Section 8 housing and they don't pay their piece of the rent, it's impossible to evict them.
Yeah, that's another government program gone awry. And in parts of California now, it's illegal not to take Section 8 recipients. And, some landlords have figured out a way to make it work doing Section 8 housing. Some have a lot of problems with it. But it's one of these government programs that is comes down from on high. And it's just become a bureaucratic nightmare to administer this. I mean, I can tell stories of, I personally had a townhouse that I rented once to a Section 8, and I can tell the stories of having going down to the county welfare office because I wasn't getting paid from either the county or the resident, and it was a complete mess. And that, because of that sort of experience, too many landlords get soured on accepting Section 8. It's a program that kind of makes sense. It is government shoveling money into a sector of the economy, which causes the prices to go up somewhat. And there is these economists who can talk about the negative externalities of that kind of program. But to the extent that it helps people that are really down and out, the program could be tailored better, and it could be managed a lot better. So landlords like yourselves wouldn't have had that kind of experience, or I wouldn't have had the kind of experience. It was a better managed program.
Yeah, I mean, the consequences have to be the same. If you're not paying your rent, the landlord can't take a 20% deduction on their mortgage payment to the bank.
Well, even worse, in the post-COVID world, you've had these series of eviction moratoria in cities, and a nationwide one, but cities and counties across the United States. I mean, Los Angeles just got rid of their eviction moratoria. So you had landlords, hundreds and thousands of landlords really footing the bill for tenants who were not paying rent, tenants who were going on vacations, where the landlords were dipping into their retirement savings and doing anything they can to keep, because they still had to pay their mortgages, they still have to pay their taxes, still have to pay the utilities depending on how the lease is set up. And the tenants were just living high on the hog without any fear of getting eviction. And that's just a dereliction of government's duty. The COVID emergency was rather short-lived compared to the length of some of these eviction moratoria. And it's the sort of thing that makes anybody thinking about getting into the rental business say, wait a minute, I don't want to invest my money in rental housing and potentially have another eviction moratoria coming down at the next pandemic or the next government decision. Look, it's becoming increasingly hard to evict people in the normal circumstances. It takes a very long time. There are all sorts of tricks tenants can play to stay in units much longer because government is not doing its duty to help landlords evict tenants who are not paying the rent. I mean, I have sympathy for landlords, for tenants who cannot pay the rent, but it's not the landlord's responsibility to be the social welfare provider of the last resort. And you have landlords where it's difficult to evict are getting out of the business. The small mom and pop landlords are becoming increasingly rare. Large corporate owners are stepping into their place, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, the IRS tax forms show that 7% of Americans get some rental income. That number is going down because people are getting out of the rental business. So, having a vibrant rental economy makes a lot of sense. People with capital can buy and fix up units, rent them out, and provide housing. It's for as long as there have been people that have been providing rental housing. We shouldn't make it more difficult to do that.
James, is there a city or a model that's doing, say, model zoning legislation really well? Or is there do you have, as an intellectual exercise, like what is a good compromise for zoning that, say, keeps the neighborhood, the character of the neighborhood, but allows greater density?
I think Houston is a model that many people that have looked to for quite a while. Houston has no zoning laws, period. And there have been several times where people have attempted to get zoning in, and the working class Houstonians are the ones that have voted most heavily against it because they understand what would happen to them down the pike. Instead, people in Houston neighborhoods may get together and enter into private contracts, covenants, codes, restrictions amongst themselves in 20-year contracts that keep the density the way they like it. And then 20 years, they get to rethink it, saying, well, look, people are growing around us. We can make more money by converting to duplexes, small apartments, or whatever. But it's really a voluntary thing on part of the residents, and it's not imposed upon them by government. There's a study that was done by an economist and lawyer professor from the University of San Diego a number of years ago, comparing Houston with other rent-controlled jurisdictions. And what he found was that land use patterns are essentially the same. People agree amongst themselves to have the same results. You have corridors with businesses and apartments on these corridors, and out from the traffic corridors, you have lower density, single-family homes and that kind of thing, and people were quite happy with it. The biggest difference was cost. You didn't have this bureaucratic problem of getting years of going through the zoning process, permitting processes, and housing in Houston was substantially less or more affordable and less costly than it was in the other zone jurisdictions. So I do think there are examples of places like Houston where it has worked well.
And does your book have any other kind of top one or two solutions to the crisis?
Well, I talk about the need to wean our way out of rent control. I talk about the need to have environmental regulations that take into account not only the needs of the environment, but needs of human beings as well. We are taking large swaths of the country off the table for new home development, and sometimes that doesn't make any sense. Some of the areas that are taken off the table are really not. I mean, every area is ecologically unique, of course, but there's some areas near large population centers that really would make more sense to have housing there. We need to get rid of the lawsuit abuse where you can file lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit to stop a project. I talk about examples in my book of people that have been trying to build homes in areas and they've been stopped for lawsuits for decades. We represented somebody in Florida that was trying to build a small development. He was stopped for 24 years by litigation. A couple in Idaho that we represented were stopped for almost 2 decades by the EPA, and so on and so forth. This kind of lawsuit abuse has to stop.
Well, James, tell us how people can find more about Pacific Legal Foundation.
Well, you can go onto our website, pacificlegal.org, and learn about the cases where we represent property owners for free, trying to establish precedent that will help other property owners make reasonable use of their land. So pacificlegal.org. And to find more about my book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, you go onto the nowheretolive.org website, or just go to Amazon and type in Nowhere to Live and the book should come up.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all for taking the time to tune in again. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from, and we'll be back soon with another episode.